Morning. How's everyone doing? Feeling good? Did you guys start early this morning, or is this your first?
I started at 8 today.
Okay.
The third one.
The third. Up to date?
Right before lunch.
Okay. Nice. Good times. So yeah, I will talk about qualitative methods. From what I hear, you guys are interested in learning about other research methods aside from the more mainstream quantitative work. So I'll share. Hi, morning everybody. So most of my work, I'll talk a little bit, but I thought I'd give first a general introduction to what qualitative research is. Has anybody had any familiarity with qualitative methods before? Okay, has anybody participated in projects of qualitative nature? Okay, what kind of work was it?
It's like essentially focus groups to find out the inefficiencies in a community, like a community service group that provide services for individuals with disabilities.
Okay.
And so focus groups, and like doing thematic analysis of this group,
Okay.
finding themes and trying to help inform their practice.
Nice. Good. So thematic analysis. Excellent. So most of my background, just to share a little bit where I'm coming from, my PhD is in psychology, but very much qualitative work. So what I actually did was I went to Belize for my PhD. Anyone know where Belize is? Under Mexico. And I worked with a group of indigenous peoples there, looking at how they treat and assess mental health and how that compares to Western understandings and conceptions. And so a lot of our work was listening to them stories, following them around, like a group of healers that we worked with, to try to understand what they do and how that compares, again, to the Western system. So a lot of it was interview-based, a lot of it was in different languages, so bringing in interpretation as an important part of it as well. We did some focus groups with patients and things also to hear their experiences of what's happening. But a lot of what that is, and I'll talk about that a little bit today, is the process of ethnography. So it's really about in-depth descriptions of a cultural world, of an environment, and all the interrelationships, not just the individual experiences, but how it all works like within a cultural system in a world. So that's a little bit more in-depth from just kind of interviews and things. But some of my other work is with youth, mostly First Nations Métis youth in urban contexts in Saskatoon. So we've done some photo voice work where we give youth cameras, ask them to take photos of things in their environment that contribute to resilience and well-being, because we were really interested in the idea of resilience. And then after they would have these photos, we would meet with them and hear the stories of, okay, what's behind this photo, what's happening here, what's this mean for you? And with young people, and some of them were 16, 17, so their ability to articulate what they're experiencing and going through isn't always strong. So we found that the photos helped, really decenter that process, rather than us sitting there focused, like, okay, tell me about your experience, tell me about your life. That can be pretty intimidating for these young people. So when we had the photos up, it really helped kind of elicit their stories and experiences a lot easier. So most of my experience comes from those two contexts that I'll be sharing. And feel free to interrupt. We can make this informal, have a bit of a conversation. If there's certain things you want to know more about, less about, we can direct a little bit as we go. If that sounds good. So this is a general outline of what I was thinking, to start with philosophy a little bit, to position qualitative research and to really try to see, okay, where does that come in? How does it relate to quantitative work? Not always. Quantitative work is usually discussed, just assume that everybody knows kind of where it's positioned. But it's interesting to kind of step back and see, okay, where does that fit in with these other perspectives and its development as a research practice? Then kind of the main thing that we'll do is look at several different kinds of qualitative work and analysis type frameworks. So that's where we'll go through these narrative, discourse, and so forth. And I'll kind of share those with you, and then after that, I'll talk a little bit about analysis and interpretation of how do you, okay, so you've heard these focus groups, these stories, then what? Like, what do you do with them? How do you generate themes? How do you produce data that's informative to your practice? We'll talk about that, and then I have some actual data here, qualitative, from a project we did in the past, so I thought I could pass it out and we could actually look at it together and do some analysis and like what do we see. And there's 3 groups, I was thinking, based on different perspectives, and we could kind of compare across these perspectives how it shapes a different way of viewing the data based on the theoretical framework. So that's hopefully a couple hours this morning. So very generally, any research involves these questions, involves questions about what methods do we use, and then that kind of presupposes a methodology that's being used to inform our methods, and that is, the methodology is informed by a theoretical perspective, and all of this is informed by an epistemology or ontology. So are those, forgive me, I don't know how much philosophy and things you guys have introduced with. Words like epistemology, ontology, are those common? New?
I've heard them. Other people might.
Okay, so we'll talk about that. We'll spend some time because it's important to follow this train down to see where, when we talk about quantitative and qualitative work, where actually does that come into play? So ontology really is, okay, good, you can see everything. So this comes from an older book, but it's quite a classic in terms of being able to outline some of these different perspectives. So if you're really excited about philosophy after this, that would be a great place to go. If not, then you can just kind of trust me on the summary. So ontology, generally speaking, is a perspective of how we understand and how we define reality. So it really has to do with, ontology is like our understanding of what is real. What is the nature of reality. So there's 2 big perspectives there. One is that reality is out there, independent of me, completely objective, and I can discover that reality. I can investigate it and find things about that reality. So that's called realism, that something is out there, there's a real world, we can access it. The other one is idealism, where it's like that reality only exists insofar as there's minds to interpret it, to access it. And that reality only exists in relationship to the minds that are investigating or looking at it.
A tree follows GP right in the forest.
Exactly. Those people would argue not without the mind, whereas the other people would argue, yeah, of course the tree is there. So that's a good example. Is that somewhat clear? The basic thing is the nature of reality. So then epistemology is about, it concerns the question of knowledge. How do we generate knowledge of that reality? What is it that we do, or how is our relationship to knowledge? How do we understand how to learn of that reality? That whole system is called epistemology. And so there's different perspectives here. Following from the realist position is something called objectivism, where I can know, I can learn of that reality, again, independent of myself, independent of the instruments that I use and so forth. Whereas the other perspective, there's several, but just to simplify it, another view of that is constructivism, where I generate knowledge of something as I'm interacting with it. And my process of interacting with it constructs knowledge of that entity. Does that make sense? So epistemology about knowledge, how do we know? Ontology about reality and what's there. So we still haven't seen anything about quantitative, qualitative yet. So this informs different kinds of research perspectives, large theoretical orientations that shape the kinds of questions that make sense, the lens through which we're investigating that reality or asking those kinds of questions. So I won't focus too much time on here, but basically these are theoretical perspectives are just like crystallizations of assumptions of epistemology and ontology. And they kind of just frame and answer these questions for us. So when we follow a certain theoretical perspective, we're following a certain assumption about what reality is and how we access that reality. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's the general input. Then methodology is where we start to see the words quantitative and qualitative. It is not until we start to think of what are the tools, what are the means by which we generate knowledge of that reality that we're interested in learning about. So here, broadly speaking, methodology comes in, quantitative and qualitative distinction comes in at the level of methodology. And this informs then what kind of methods make sense. So methods are very specific to the instruments, the tools, the surveys that I might give out, the interview questions that I'm going to ask somebody to generate knowledge of that. And so very generally, quantitative is like quanta. It focuses on numbers, turning values that I'm interested in into numbers, numerical relationships, so I can start to use statistics and things to manipulate, to understand what's happening. Whereas qualitative, qualia, has to do with words and meaning. So that's some of the distinction there. Any questions about that? It's kind of a very just quick flow through. Clear? Wondering why this matters? I'm hoping to convince you that it's why it matters by the end. So this is just another way of looking at it rather than the kind of flow chart idea. This just shows how each one following is informed by the one before. And so the important thing that I want to mention is probably you're most familiar with statistical quantitative research. That tends to be more common, especially in the biomedical sciences. So I want to just help people understand or help you reflect on the fact that that comes from a very specific ontology, that comes from a very specific epistemology. But often these days it's not even talked about. People don't reflect on where that comes from. It's just like that's the assumed way of doing things. And so that's the important thing to think about in terms of qualitative methods is that is one way of looking at reality. That's one assumption, that's one perspective, but there are others. There are others out there. There are different ways of viewing reality and of therefore doing research and identifying aspects of reality that you're interested in. So subjectivism we won't really talk about because that gets a little bit different in terms of how we talk about it, a little more extreme into like relativism and things. So most of what we'll talk about today is constructivism and objectivism and kind of those relationships and specifically how they inform very specific like methods of generating data. And I can post these or give them if that's useful in any way. So just very generally, when you look at textbooks about defining, what they do in definitions is they immediately invoke like the theoretical or philosophical framework in order to define those traditions. So when we look at a very general definition of quantitative research, it's one that uses post-positivist claims for developing knowledge. So post-positivism is again like an epistemological framework that makes assumptions about reality. So I only say this not to be confusing, but just to state when we talk about quantitative work, it immediately invokes assumptions of that philosophical nature. So, but often, and that's one of the good things that we can do when we start to read articles and like critique is think about the degree to which they're reflecting on those assumptions that they're making as they're carrying out that work. And often there isn't many reflections on that. It's just like, I'm going to just do what everybody else did before me because that's kind of what's normal in my field. But what they're actually doing is invoking these philosophical premises behind their work. And then qualitative is often again defined in relationship to these philosophical principles, and you look at general definitions, constructivists, so ideas that involve multiple meanings for reality, that there isn't one truth out there, that we learn about that truth in dialogue, in conversation with each other, and those words that we use help us to get at that truth, that reality. Any questions about how are we doing? Clear? Good. So then within, if we spend the rest of the time just talking about the one stream, the qualitative stream, there's a lot of different ways of doing qualitative work. So we'll look at these 6 or 7 and try to look at how the research questions are maybe a little bit different, the goals, what the researcher's role is in terms of perspectives of like bias or like their relationship to the data, the individuals, the participants, also the skills they need, time, funds, like we'll explore a little bit of that as we go. So narrative theory. So again, this is at that level of methodology, and it shapes your specific methods or what you might do when you're with somebody. And often what the methods are interviews, focus groups. These are common across all of the qualitative methods, but the kinds of questions or the ways in which you might interact with the people are different, or the kind of interpretations that you'll do once you have a story. Now how are you going to look at that story? How are you going to make meaning from that story, from that interaction? That's where these theories come in. So this one, very much like if you're familiar with narrative, the idea of storytelling, this lens, when you look at and analyze an interview, a qualitative interview, or even focus groups, what you're focusing on here is kind of those different elements that make a story. Like what are the tensions? Who are the main characters? Who are the actors? What's the drama? What's the play, like the situation happening? Is there a climax? Is there villains that the person's afraid of, for lack of, all kind of obviously metaphorical. But those are the things you're kind of trying to look at and pay attention to when you're analyzing this way. So it might follow kind of a similar plot trajectory, how the narrative is told. So you're also looking at how is the story told? Are we in a comedy? Are we in a drama? Is this a tragedy? Like what's the kind of genre that is being invoked here by use of different words or metaphors or symbols and things? So that's one way of looking at this. And also another thing is like the relationship between the individual's story and also like broader narratives that might exist within a culture or a society, and how is the individual bringing on metaphors or drawing on stories and themes that are found within like a particular society. So looking at that relationship is also part of this analysis as well. So I already mentioned, looks for patterns, looks for how the story is told, how somebody uses story to make sense and find meaning in their experience. A big one in medical context is the process of diagnosis. Like I might have these experiences and things happening with me and I'm not quite sure. What I'm interested in is seeking out a diagnosis that maybe tells me what the plot of my experience is. What should I expect? What have other people experienced in this case? And so individuals, maybe with chronic illnesses or things, sometimes that is the struggle, is what is this called? How do we understand it? But it's all that search for what's the story, what's the narrative here.
For people who are looking at the use of metaphors in medicine, would that fall under the narrative analysis, or would that fall under?
I would very much be in narrative, yeah. Metaphors is a big part of this, like how they draw on those different ideas to express. Is that something you guys come across or research you've seen?
I have separate from this.
especially because a lot of you here are interested in working with young people, right, and children. So obviously, yeah. So looking at stories, looking at metaphors is obviously a big way that children express themselves and articulate what they're experiencing and going through. So the analysis, so we might start to look at, okay, what is the structure here? What is there a beginning, a middle, end, like those different aspects, like almost, you'd find themes, but are they pointing somewhere? Are they drawing on other metaphors and theories from the wider society, like we talked about? Are there different things like political elements? Maybe that doesn't come in with children in that yet, but that might be more older populations drawing on different aspects to inform their story, might be of interest to you. So yeah, that's generally the narrative framework. So one that's similar, but a little bit different, and this one draws on metaphor as well, but it's a little bit distinct in terms of paying attention more to how words are used to elicit certain responses. So discourse analysis really focuses at the practice that's being elicited in language. So why am I using that word? What am I trying to invoke in the people I'm engaging with? Am I trying to generate sympathy? Am I trying to help people understand my experience? Like what am I using those words for in terms of an outcome or an action element is more what discourse analysis focuses on. So a lot of discourse analysis actually looks at the media and like framing of like race debates or things that are pretty contemporary right now, like a lot of talk about that, like how is that framed? How is that discussed? So that's all around discourse analysis, might look at like a media transcript and be like, okay, look how they're trying to manipulate maybe different people into thinking different ways and things. That's very much what discourse analysis is interested in. So a big part of this also is like a critical lens to kind of critique or see what are the intentions or what's the purpose of using that discourse and that language and what might that evoke. So there's a little bit of a critical perspective here that maybe isn't the same in narrative, whereas the narrative is more appreciating what the person's saying for their own right, and you're just kind of like listening to that story, whereas here you're questioning, like why are they saying that? What are they using this word for? What's the purpose, and so forth? And how do those words affect people's opinions, attitudes, behaviors, that kind of thing. So that's discourse analysis. And these two, by the way, just as a little flag for later with this exercise, narrative, discourse analysis, and this next one, phenomenology, is the three that we'll try to work with and use on some of the data that I brought here. So phenomenology, so this one now is a little bit different. It still draws on interviews and focus groups, but it's what it's really interested in is experience, and like what is that experience like for somebody. And it's almost like, one way of loosely presenting or sharing this is like documentaries. Like sometimes documentaries are really good at showcasing like a reality or a world to us that we may have never known existed. Phenomenology is similar in that sense of trying to provide an understanding of what it's like for these individuals. So there's been a lot of interesting work on things like substance abuse, like addictions, like what is that like for these individuals? What is the essence of that experience, like day to day, the feelings, the emotions, what they're going through, the decisions that they make. Phenomenology is really good at providing like an in-depth analysis of that. And so it's often very low numbers of participants with phenomenology because it's almost like case studies. Like maybe you'll have 2, 3, 4 people and you're really following them over a long time, maybe multiple interviews with the same people, really trying to understand what's going on with them and for them. Try to get at the essence. the essence of addiction, like what is it like for those individuals? What do they deal with? What do they struggle with? This book, Phenomenology of Perception, was one of the kind of the leading theoretical perspectives that drove this position, this framework. And one of the things that's also maybe unique a little bit to phenomenology is a very specific engagement or focus on the body and what it's like for people to be embodied and engaging with their body in that way. So hearing like what it's like to experience addictions and what that feels like in their body, like for them. So really trying to elicit those kind of experiences, like a little more visceral interest, whereas narrative, you might not kind of focus on the body so much and be concerned with that as like an embodied experience. How are we doing? Any thoughts, questions? Is this all pretty new, straightforward?
It's fairly new.
Fairly new? Am I going too fast or?
No, that's good.
It's okay? Okay, just give me some cues. I don't want to just stand here and just die.
Yeah, it's good that you're relating it to like the things that we're familiar with, like documentaries and stuff, so we understand the correlation between the word that you call it and what it is.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, these words, sometimes they have these fancy words, phenomenology, epistemology, all these things. Yeah, phenomenology, really the basis, if you break it down, it's like trying to understand the phenomenon, the science of a particular phenomenon or like event or experience is what it's really interested in, what they're all about. So, ethnography. So, this is what I did when I was in Belize. And so, different from phenomenology, maybe, you meet with somebody once a week, you have a few interviews, and you kind of follow them over time, but it's a little bit looser engagement in terms of like the position of the researcher. And same with narrative analysis, like maybe I'll do one interview with somebody and then I can kind of analyze the story and look at their plot. Or discourse analysis, maybe I don't even do interviews, I look at like a news article and that's my data. Whereas this, it involves typically a lot more engagement from the researcher. And so this method comes from anthropology. If you're familiar with some anthropological methods where you actually submerge yourself into a world, and part of the insights, part of the knowledge that you generate of that world actually come from your own reflections and experiences while you're in that place. And so ethnography, more than others, really relies on the researcher as part of the tool, as part of the instrument that generates knowledge of the area, whatever research topic you're interested in. So for me, this was, again, we were looking at primarily conceptions of mental health, illness, and also just well-being and even very basic things like how do these healers in this context, these indigenous healers, even understand things like the mind and body and like those different relationships and how do they generate that information. So, spending a lot of time with them, following them around I lived in Belize for about 9 months during this time to be able to really just be there, be a part of the day-to-day, because a lot of interesting things sometimes just happen, like while you're, stopping for gas at a store, all of a sudden like a conversation will come up and you'll be like, oh, that's very interesting. You like get out your notebook, you like make some notes. Okay. So that's kind of more, ethnography is like really submersing yourself in there and getting a real in-depth perspective. So it often also can involve mixed methods, which maybe we'll talk a little bit at the end. Sometimes people do bring in surveys and other aspects of data collection while they're doing ethnography, because you're trying to kind of describe like a whole world or whole system. So the more ways you have to do that can help. So sometimes individual interviews, sometimes you'll do focus groups, sometimes surveys, all kinds of different ways, sometimes just observation. That's another big piece of this, is actually just like participant observation of what's happening and like describing it. So a lot of descriptive methodology in the sense of what we would do is go to patient visits as well, like therapeutic encounters, and be just observing that process and making notes and trying to see, how did the healer interact with the patient? How did they describe what the diagnosis was? Do they do that? Is that even important? Like just trying to understand the whole clinical environment, clinical context, from their world, their perspective also involves a lot of just observation. And sometimes we would even videotape those clinical encounters and then show them back to the healers or some of the translators and be like, okay, can you run through this for us? Like what's going on here? Why did you do that? What's happening here? And really trying to kind of understand and pick it apart, so to speak. So a lot of different kinds of approaches can be used here. And these are some pictures. This is what it often looks like. Clinical encounters are often in people's homes. You go to their homes, the healer would travel. So back in the day, we used to have house calls here where a doctor would go to people's homes if they were sick or something. It's very much that kind of system. So they would, all their healing would often just happen like that in people's homes. And so that's another piece of it is photos. You would do a lot of photos, obviously getting consent and things from everybody along the way, but capturing moments and things as well in photography is often useful. And you can ask them questions about it later, but also just to give you insight into that world a little better. Yeah. Kind of looking at the patterns, the behavior, you're trying to understand the whole culture. So not only what's going on here, but why, what is the beliefs or the understandings that inform why you made that decision and things. So you're it's a little more trying to get at the whole rational framework of thoughts and beliefs and understandings, values. So it often what it happens too is you have one research question, but you end up having to learn about a whole bunch of things in order to answer just that one question. So we talked about this a lot, participatory observation, being part of activities. So we would go to different ceremonies, events, things. This is me with the group. One of the group, there's about 5 or 6 healers that we worked with while I was there. And field notes, that's another thing. So I mentioned something would happen and then you'd want to reflect on it, write notes. So I wrote a lot of notes at the end of each day, and that becomes your data that you analyze with interviews, with other aspects of the engagement in the research process. Yes, please.
With ethnography, is it more of a narrative perspective in the sense of sharing lived experiences, or more similar to the discourse where you are picking apart and critiquing? Or can you do either?
Yeah, it can kind of depend on what the goals of the research are. So part of our goals, or the reason why the research was happening, was to help create a relationship between the healers, like the traditional medical system, and the biomedical system and doctors. So in our work with the doctors, we would often try to help them see some of the relevance in what the healers are doing, because as you can imagine, there's a lot of skepticism of indigenous knowledge and healers and things. And so we're trying to, critical perspectives and lens on the biomedical system is useful in that context, in helping them kind of reflect on their own assumptions and their own practice and what's best practice in those contexts. Yeah, a little bit. But in terms of the healers, we also had to be sensitive there, being overly critical of different aspects of their work. We have to be sensitive to their knowledge, and that we're coming in with a different framework and things too. But yeah, how you end up doing the specific analysis and what your goals are and what kind of writing you do and what kind of research you publish from it is definitely aligned with what your goals are and what you're trying to do. And most ethnography is coupled with a kind of an activist lens, in the sense, nowadays anyway. Back in the day, it was more about almost aligned with like the colonial
Tourism.
Yeah, a little bit for sure. Whereas now it's like engaged with like a problem that a community is facing, and as a researcher you go to assist with that problem. So you're very much engaged in that problem. You care for that problem. So the idea of like the researcher being objective and neutral and, oh, like you're struggling with that dam, that water dam like came and ruined your community, you know, that's too bad. Like there's nothing I can do about it. Like those kind of attitudes are, it's very much like, wow, like, yeah, that sucks that dam happened. Like, let's see what we can do. Let's capture your stories. Like, how is that impacting you? Let's see if we can lobby. Like, it's very much coupled with an outcome, with action nowadays. Yeah.
Would you say too, when I think of ethnography compared to the others that you mentioned, I would think you are never going to be a part of that community in the sense that you aren't from there, but it's a much more immersive process than the other ones he's talked about so far. So it's like, hence the anthropology piece, like you're really,
Absolutely.
you're observing, and hopefully your lens of observation is accurate because you're actually then representing for a group that can't speak, they can, but can't in the same sense.
Yeah.
So it's a different kind of, whereas the narrative and the approach to the question was different, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah, very much. And that's why with this approach too, it's really important to have advisors or guidance from the community so that, okay, this is what I want to share at this conference about your work. Like, does this make sense? You have a lot more of that feedback and guidance from the community. Whereas the narrative piece, it's like, this is my interpretation of that. And it's like understood that that's my experience, that's my understanding. Whereas with this, yeah, you're wanting to be a little bit more close to what's actually happening and therefore invite a lot more feedback and guidance with that process. So grounded theory is similar to some of the other ones that we've talked about already, but it has a very specific aim of generating theory, hence grounded theory. So the idea of like going into a situation, a context, understanding, investigating it, and coming out of those questions with a theory that can then go back and inform different kinds of practice or maybe future research. So maybe there's not a lot is known about something, and this is a good tool to kind of spur on future research and, okay, help us narrow specific questions. So one case that we have used this in Saskatoon, that's where I'm from. I did all my schooling in Saskatoon, so I've only been here about a year and a half, so I still have some research connections there. And one project that we've been working on is actually Indigenous HIV/AIDS patients, their experience with that condition, and also their reasons for limited access to treatment and what's going on there. If you've heard anything, if any of you are familiar with HIV/AIDS in Canada, Saskatchewan has the highest rates, sometimes higher than a lot of African countries, and it's rising. So there's like this really, wow, like, okay, what's going on? And it's primarily among Indigenous populations. So there's been a lot of statistical kind of analysis, like doing snapshots and like epidemiology and things. It's like, okay, but we were invited to go in to say, like, what is happening for these people? What's their story? Like, what's the experiences? And from that, can we generate some theories or insights about what to do to address this issue? And so we did interviews with about 30 of these patients, and the big thing, I mean, it maybe is not surprising, but the big thing that came out of that was experiences of racism in the healthcare system, and that actually is preventing them from any kind of treatment, and therefore the spreading of the condition is happening kind of without any serious control of what's happening. So that just kind of shapes, so racism is one side, I guess, but the other one is stigma from within the Indigenous community. So the idea of disclosure of your condition is actually, very fearful idea. And for sure that can be anywhere, but in this context it's maybe heightened because of the stigma and the racism and the identity politics and all these different layers So people are very not willing to disclose that condition. And a lot of the research suggests like where there's more disclosure, like treatment is like it's usually better situation when people are able to disclose, like to their family, friends, or even just to their healthcare providers. So anyway, that kind of informed this idea that interventions should really focus on helping people be able to talk about this condition and to help, and then also address in the wider community ideas of stigma and like basic education about what this condition is and how people get it and so forth. So anyway, that was a grounded theory approach. Yeah.
I feel like that's a very good example of where qualitative, generally speaking, research is so essential, because you can quantify however many number of people have something, if you're even asking, but you can't necessarily understand why that proceeds or why that continues. And you certainly can't, for people who are marginalized within an already marginalized population, who don't identify with the available HIV services, really can't do that. So then if you're doing the work that you're doing, you're making it possible for those people not only to have a voice, but also to then ask the necessary questions about, well, how do we make protocols and processes so that these people can obtain and feel safe using, which I think, medically speaking, we tend to poo-poo a lot of qualitative work historically, and probably still, but that's where no quantitative study will ever answer those questions, and ultimately those people will never receive treatment if you're not providing that kind of care. Sorry, my limiting rant, but.
No, it's good. I mean, because it does illuminate certain aspects of the reality that maybe are uncovered or not captured by quantitative work.
Well, I was also thinking about accessing populations in a very sort of Western biomedical world doesn't really jive with indigenous knowledge and knowledge translation and all that. And that's really very.
Yes, and we'll talk about that, because one of the methodologies is indigenous methodologies and what that means and what that looks at. Yeah. So yeah, grounded theory again is very good at generating further research, other questions, other aspects, illuminating particular things, generating theory, usually go through those kind of cycles, looking at the different process, trying to generate solutions. It can involve, usually it does involve interviews as well, but it's very focused on the sense of, I guess maybe one way to differentiate it is narrative work and discourse analysis and even phenomenology. You're kind of going into the project with a lens, like with a theory that is then helping you inform what kind of questions to ask, and what then therefore that shapes what kind of information or what stories are produced is highly related to the kind of questions or the way you interact. Whereas grounded theory, you actually try to go into the situation without theory. So you're really trying to actually not do any literature reviews or anything before the process begins. You're trying to have kind of a very open, just really free understanding of what's happening, and then once you generate some theory, then you go back to the literature and see, okay, this is what we discovered, this is what we generated here, and how might that compare to what's already been happening in other places. And so it happens a little bit backwards in terms of most research, you do a big literature review, okay, what are the gaps, and let's go address the gaps. This is a little bit different in that sense. Is that you have a problem, you want to learn about it, you don't look at theory, you don't look at previous literature, the problem is the literature review, if that makes sense. Like you want to understand what the situation is, what the problem. So it's a little bit flipped in that way. And the theory emerges like inductively, so it's coming out. Grounded theory, it's coming from the research. And then for future research, like then I might take this theory and apply that to my narrative study later. Like that's kind of how we get other theories, is from this kind of work. So another approach is participatory action research. So this sometimes might be connected with ethnography a little bit, because you're kind of like doing things with people over time. But here it's like what you're doing as a researcher is you're kind of going to empower and build capacity in the community that you're interested in working with for them to design research to address their own questions. And you as a researcher are kind of there to support, to accompany, to learn alongside them. But really it's like those people are the researchers, and you're almost like training new researchers to do that. So in the youth work that I do, this is something that's very important, because there's a lot of discourse right now on like youth empowerment and youth voices, and how a lot of our decisions, like government levels and things, like aren't involving youth, and how do we get youth voice into policy, into those decisions that affect their lives. So participatory action research then is specifically geared at that. You know, some of the work that we're starting in Winnipeg now, going forward, is participatory action projects with youth on the North End. We're starting with 5 youth, bringing them together and training them as research assistants, essentially, in this kind of model, and asking them, and you know, the beginning, it kind of starts with like a focus group. Like, what are some of the needs that you've identified in your community? What can we do to support them? What kind of research would you like to do? So it's like way at the beginning, the researcher really just has an idea to help more research happen in the community, and they go to the community and partner and collaborate, and then they do it together. They carry this out together. So I go to these youth not with a specific framework. I mean, some of the things you go with like a strength-based approach and like that, like you don't want to kind of have the whole conversation focused on the negative things, especially in marginalized kind of environments. So you do want to try to help build on strengths and positive aspects of their reality. But generally, yeah, you're like giving them the tools and you're just there to support them. And then you carry out research and you reflect together. So it takes a while. Like the projects that we're starting now in Winnipeg and Saskatoon are going to be long, like 3-4 year projects with youth, where they become the protagonists of their own research and their own questions. And we're there to support, provide finances and so forth of what they need to carry out these projects. And often also what they tend to be is for young people or certain things, this kind of work, like it has the term action in there, because often youth aren't going to say, well, we should go and talk to people and interview them. It's like, for them in their world, like that's not very interesting, or that's not going to add to any results. What young people want to do often is do something together that changes their community, and then reflect or observe or monitor or evaluate those changes that we do together. So that's often what is going to happen. Typically, that's how the conversations evolve. Is in some other context, just as an example, is like doing art-based installations in maybe like an inner city neighborhood, and maybe doing like setting up photos, or maybe even like murals, like, okay, let's do a huge mural somewhere, and then like observe, okay, how did that change the dynamic of the community? That action that we took, did that make people feel more hopeful in this neighborhood, or, you know, some kind of thing that we're looking for? So that's what I mean by action, is like you actually do something together. Maybe a garden. There's been a lot of work on the community gardens in urban contexts, doing that together. Okay, now how does that build community? How does that build wellness? How does that build like empowerment, self-efficacy, like not only for the individual participants, but also what's the community impact as well? So that's why participatory action research, I think, is really interesting in that sense, because again, you can kind of see like concepts of like objective research, and you don't want the researcher to impact. It's like, well, you're a part of that like transformation. You're there, you're with them, you're making decisions, you're planting trees or painting buildings, like, and that's the kind of research. So that's the kind of stuff that's close to my heart, because it's like you're in the community, you're doing stuff, but also you're generating knowledge that's useful for other contexts as well. And axiology, another ology word for you, is maybe more so comes up here and in ethnography, and really it has to do with axiology is all about like morals and values and your ethical engagement with that population or with that community. So in research, axiology really has to do with your ethical framework. and not just the university. Like the university has ethical standards, of course, for research, but if you really look at what those are, a lot of it is like legal protection for the university. And sure, there's a little bit of protection for the participants, and that's important, but the big, like if you do a discourse analysis on what ethics boards are looking for, a lot of it is protect the university, which is important. But axiology gets more also into how to engage and work with the community in a good way. And so with Indigenous work, that involves all kinds of other protocols and ways of being and engaging with young people in the community. Right? That's maybe in addition to or separate from the ethics boards at the university as well.
Would you say that, like, I think of participatory action research as the end goal is both to benefit and to allow the group that you're working with, the community, to strengthen them in some way.
Yes.
As well as to allow for a conversation within that environment. But then ultimately there's more of an effect. There can be more of a direct impact on policy versus, and it can be more difficult to publish that kind of research, whereas there's a lot of our other research that we do all the time that is quite publishable, has checked all the research boxes, but ultimately doesn't necessarily apply or is useful within. So it's kind of, I kind of think of them as, I mean, they should be similar, but in fact, it involves a very different type of outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the whole publishability policy, all those things are obviously important conversations around this work. Where do you share this information is important.
We did a photo voice project back home, and ultimately we didn't do it formally as a research project. We did it as an advocacy type project, which also changes your ability to share it.
Yes.
But then also the priority is not to necessarily share it, because your goal is to allow a population to have a voice and in turn to have a conversation with the people they needed to,
yes.
which is what came from that project. But it was interesting then coming back into like the medical school world where that isn't always the priority focus, and so people say, well, what do you mean you didn't print something from that, or what do you mean you didn't, and you're like, well, that wasn't the goal. And ultimately if anyone was going to publish, it should have been the kids who were involved, or you know
yes.
what I mean? So it just doesn't always parallel our environment.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's
The
a lot
one that we're in more so than the one that you're in, but
yes. And my world and your worlds need to have more conversations.
yes, they do.
But yes, that's generally, it involves those broader kinds of questions. Even these kind of perspectives, like research with people versus on people. So you can just start to think of like how that informs the research or a different kind of approach. So arts-based methods, so I put this as a separate piece, but this does often fall into ethnography sometimes. This does fall into participatory action research, as we just saw. Like young people might decide that, yeah, we do want to do a photo voice project, and that does fit, and that is what we want to, how we want to express ourselves and some of the issues that we're facing in our community. But it also can be somewhat separate in terms of how we understand the data and looking at art as a potential. Like we talked a lot about words as, well, I don't know if we talked a lot about it, but qualitative work generally works with words as the data piece, whereas this then now expands that to think of other means of data, so video clips, even like social media. There's some people that do interesting analysis of like Facebook and that, but definitely photos, just other kinds of drawings, pictures. There's some interesting things people do with like body mapping, like drawing their bodies out and saying like, okay, like where is the pain and what is that like, and then putting it up around the wall and just helping people kind of sense again what's going on for those people in like different mediums other than just words or just numbers. There's a whole world of ways of expressing data in arts. And another reason why this is interesting is you probably heard when we talked a little bit about publishing, you were talking about those, like what do you do with this stuff now that we have this knowledge? knowledge translation and exchange, KT, you've probably heard some of that stuff and the importance of that in terms of taking this knowledge. Arts-based research, when you have data that's art, it creates interesting opportunities to share that with the wider community. One of the things we did with our work in Saskatoon with youth was our art exhibit, where we rented out a whole studio and filled the whole place with their photos and invited like the whole community of Saskatoon, and it was up for 2 weeks, and people came and just had this interesting exchange with the photos. And so it creates like a little more opportunity for public discourse, how to have impact, how to make your research have an impact. When you have something beautiful to share, it just creates, not everybody likes to sit and read like a 20-page or 10-page research article. Sometimes it just sits there, and like, how do you give it traction? Some of the ways, art is actually a really interesting way to give research traction, to engage in policy makers. We invited like the city council and mayors and tribal councils to come, and our project was all focused around resilience. So trying to like change the narrative of inner city Indigenous youth to, hey, look at all these amazing things that are happening in the inner city, all the strengths that are there, look at all the resources they have, like the beauty, and the whole room was filled with these photos of positive stories of inner city Indigenous youth. And when you're walking through it, it just helps to shape your perspective of that group or reality, or change some of the things that we see in the media over and over. And inviting media into this process was big too. Like in a lot of our work, we try to engage the media to help us with that piece, that knowledge translation piece. So yeah, arts-based, and especially with kids, like drawing, there's so many interesting things to do with young people in terms of how they can express what they're feeling, expressing pain. You've seen some of Roberta Woodgate's work. Are you guys familiar with her work?
They will be soon.
They will be soon, okay. She's done she's an amazing researcher here at the university who has a huge career in qualitative work with young people. A lot of different things she looks at, like substance abuse, addictions, pain, trauma, and using a lot of art to help children find a medium to kind of communicate and express themselves. Because interviews, quite frankly, don't always work very well with that age group and population. And so it's good to think of other ways of engaging them. So the last piece that I want to talk about in terms of methodologies is something that's called Indigenous methodologies, or bringing in specifically alternative knowledge systems, or other ways, I don't want to say alternative, but other ways of understanding reality, like ontology, epistemology, those questions that we talked about before. What these methodologies do is bring in a different lens to help shape that conversation, or the kinds of questions that people might ask. So a lot of what I've talked about so far, and arguably participatory action research or ethnography, there might be some differences there, but for the most part, a lot of the stuff that I talked about was generated from Western cultural systems, Western science, North American, European assumptions of individual autonomy and rights and freedoms and individualism and materialism, and all those kind of assumptions are part of those research methods. Like because they were developed in that culture, they're informed by that way of thinking and viewing the world too. So Indigenous methodologies is interesting because it's a critique to that system. And it's also a critique to a lot of work. I mean, now there's been a lot of work with TRC and a lot of different developments to improve how research is happening, that it actually has benefit for people, that it's working with people. But the history, I don't know how much you know about the history of research in Canada, it hasn't been good in terms of its engagement with Indigenous communities and Indigenous people. A lot of it has been done on people going into communities without their permission, asking questions, even taking like blood samples and things, going in for a couple weeks and then just leaving, doing all this kind of analysis, and then publishing papers like, oh, look, Indigenous people are less healthy, and the community's like, oh, like when did you even, like, what's happening? There wasn't even that engagement, that dialogue. So those concepts of like axiology were not thought through. There wasn't a lot of principles and policies. Like now we have a tri-council policy statement on ethics from the CHR and SHRC and NSERC. Chapter 9 specifically of that document goes into ethics and policies. It's a long chapter about how to work with and engage Indigenous communities. And so now, like recently, you know, that's in the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of work to help create research that's more ethical, more community-based, more working with people in partnerships, collaborating rather than power over and those kind of things. So that's been hard for researchers because they've had to kind of humble themselves in terms of allowing power to be shared.